Hi, everyone. My name is Chastity Simmons. I am one of the PhD students for the Stone Center for Latin American Studies. We are here with Professor Andres Gomez-Lobo. He is from La Universidad de Chile, and he's here to talk to us a little bit about spatial inequality and a project that he is working on. So if you can, tell us a little bit about yourself and then jump right into your project.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Let me just start by saying that I'm not a specialist in inequality or poverty issues. I come more from a micro industrial organization background, and what I've worked most on is transport. In fact, I was Minister of Transport in Chile for 3 years. And that's how I arrived at this topic, because spatial inequality has being a geographical issue has a lot to do with transport, which I'll talk about further on in this talk. So to start, let me just say that inequality has a spatial dimension. That is, it's something that's not been looked at very often, but how people distribute in space affects their access to goods and services, and how the infrastructure is built will affect, therefore, their access and to opportunities, to education, to labor market, etc. And so what we wanted to do in this talk, and this is joint work with Daniel Oviedo from University College London, is to look at a bit at inequality in Latin America, but from a spatial dimension. And we looked at three scales of analysis. Spatial inequality can be thought of as happening at different scales. One is that has been, I think, the most studied, is the rural-urban divide. That is, how do urban areas differ from rural areas, and particularly how poverty is concentrated in rural areas, particularly linked to also ethnic minorities, etc. Then there's a second scale of analysis, which is the capital versus the rest of the cities, or centralization, as it can be called. In the words of Ferreira, and Lanju, also the metropolitan bias. That is, that bigger cities get more attention, they may get more resources than smaller urban areas, and there may be inequality coming from that dimension. And then the third dimension is within cities. That is, how people are spread out in an urban area, and we usually call that segregation or urban segregation. Right, so these are the three scales we want to look at. There's been some work in some of this issues. One is in certain ways similar to what we do in this paper, and that is decompose an inequality measure across regions or provinces or urban, rural, coast, interior for developing countries. There were only in that study of sharks and one, there's only 2 Latin American countries, however. And then another interesting thing is that Schwartzman in the US has shown that larger cities appear to be more equal than smaller cities. We'll be talking about that in a little while. Then there's an interesting study by Ferreira and Anju, where they show that poverty is more widespread in smaller and medium-sized cities in 8 developing countries. And that contrasts with the results for the US. That is, in developing countries, it seems that inequality is deeper and there's more poverty in a relative and absolute sense in smaller cities rather than the big urban areas. And then there's some studies by Spatial or ECLAC, one which is particularly interesting because it's somewhat similar to what we're going to do, and that is to compare inequality, regional inequality between Latin America and rich OECD countries. So how do we compare in that dimension with richer countries? Are we more unequal across regions compared to rich OECD countries. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at this issue. We know that income distribution is more unequal in Latin America than in developed countries. It's quite standard. But we don't know if this is the case for all the spatial scales introduced above. That is, are there structural differences between spatial inequality in Latin America compared to richer countries? And depending on our results, the policy implications are very different, and we'll talk about that later on. So what we do is we decompose, and this is quite conventional, we decompose an income distribution measure, in this case, the mean log deviation, or also called entropy zero, of household disposable income across two of the three scales mentioned above, and compare that to richer countries, between Latin America and richer countries. The reason we decompose the mean log deviation and not the Gini coefficient or the Thiel index is because it's easier to decompose, and they're basically very correlated among themselves. So whatever we find for the mean log deviation would probably be the same if we decompose the Thiel index or the Gini index. Now, for segregation within urban areas, we cannot use this first data I'm going to talk about, but we discuss this issue further below using other data. So what we do is we use the Luxembourg income study databases. The advantage of this is that this harmonized household data for OECD countries and some Black countries. We have survey data for 9 Latin American countries. There's the countries and the year of the survey. And for 13 developed countries, also the countries and the year. And we have variables such as the region, whether it's the household lives in a rural area, the size of the locality of residence, type of area, etc., in addition to income variables. We decompose, as I mentioned before, the total inequality, the log deviation of total disposable income inequality, in 5 terms. The first one is we look at the total income inequality. How much is that due to within large urban areas inequality? That is, like, for example, large cities or metropolitan areas. How unequal is income distributed within those areas? Then within smaller or non-central urban areas, that is how income is distributed among households within smaller urban areas. Then also the same within rural areas, that is how unequal is income within rural areas. And then the between terms, that is how much inequality is due to the average income between large or metropolitan areas or central urban areas and smaller or secondary urban areas, and how much is due to difference between the average of urban areas income and the average rural area income, right? So it's a classical decomposition, but the novelty here is that we decompose between rural and urban, and then urban between large urban areas or central urban areas and smaller urban areas. Now, to do this, we have to talk about some empirical issues. One is that decomposing disposable income does not control for differences in the cost of living in these different areas. That is, if housing prices are much higher or food prices are much higher in large urban areas than in smaller urban areas or rural areas, then we're not really considering real wages or real income comparisons, right? So this could distort our comparison or our decomposition. However, at least in the case of Brazil, when different cost of living index is considered among different size urban areas, inequality is reduced somewhat, but does not change your qualitative results. So at least based in their study, one may think that this is not, our results would not be overturned if we control for different costs in different geographical areas. That is, if different cost of living differences. And also, there's another literature that says that although costs or prices may be higher in big urban areas, there are more amenities and variety, and the quality of goods is higher. And this more than compensates for the higher price. So, in fact, if you control for variety and quality, nominal wages or nominal income um, would would understate the level of inequality between large urban areas and small urban areas. That is, large urban areas, people living there, they enjoy more amenities, more variety and quality of goods, which more than compensates for their higher price. And finally, since we cannot control for this, we argue that if there's a bias, if this bias in price bias is somewhat similar between developed countries and Latin American countries, then at least our comparisons won't be as affected as if we were interested in just the absolute level of inequality rather than comparing that between Latin America and richer OECD countries. A second empirical issue has to do with administrative versus economic zone definition. That is, how do we define a large urban area if a household lives in a large urban area? There may be suburbs that are close to a large urban area that are not classified as being the city, but they're still under the area of influence of the big city, and people work there. Now, this is difficult to address because we would have to tackle this issue on a country by country basis. For example, some studies use nighttime satellite imagery to define urban areas. Obviously, we cannot do that in this study with so many countries being analyzed. But the results of Ferre for Brazil also indicate that their results are robust to different urban area definitions. So at least for the case of Brazil, this does not seem to be a major issue. And there's not much we can do about it, but we keep that in mind when analyzing our results. Now, there's a third issue, that the statistical representation at the subnational level. That is, these surveys are not statistically representative at the municipal level, for example. Now, we could use an approach called the small area poverty estimation strategy, in which you mix census data with household socioeconomic data to estimate or to impute poverty levels or income levels at smaller geographical areas, and then do the analysis. However, once again, that's not feasible in our study because we have too many countries, and it would require undertaking a very time-consuming imputation procedure for each one. And as an alternative, we chose the subnational areas defined within each of the surveys because they are representative within the survey. Thus, surveys are usually undertaken with representation, for example, rural areas and urban areas. And then there's some classification within urban areas between larger cities or regions and smaller cities. And we're going to use that information from the surveys, but this is somewhat arbitrary, and we're going to do some robustness checks for our results. And finally, something that's very important and rarely recognized
I have a
is that
quick
when you
question,
do a
Professor.
decomposition, in 99% of the time, you find that the between terms, that is, if we go to this formula, the last two terms, that is the average income between large urban areas and small urban areas, or the average income between urban areas and rural areas, these terms are usually quite small, right? And what these authors argue, and we call this the Elmo critique, not because of Sesame Street, but because of the first letter from the authors. Um, what they argue is that by construction, the between term will always be small. And this happens because if you think about it, when you compare the average income of rural areas and the average income of urban areas, you're comparing just 2 points. It's as if you had just two observations. While within inequality, you're comparing thousands of observations, right? So you're always going to get a larger inequality between thousands of households than between two average households. And so what they say is that this is misleading, and what you should do is calculate this between ratio uh, to get a gauge of how important the between term is compare the between term with the maximum that this term could reach in a given survey. For example, if you're comparing the average income between rural and urban areas, you calculate that between term. And then what you do is you calculate what's the maximum that this term would achieve if that all the poor people in the rural areas and all the richer people live in urban areas. There's no overlap in incomes. Then you have a average urban income, average rural income with that simulation, and that's the maximum that the between term could reach. And so what they say is calculate that maximum and then see how the effective real between term compares to this maximum achievable value, right? So we're going to use this methodology to compare our results. So what do we find? Well, the first result is something that we already know, and that is Latin America is much more unequal than developed countries using household disposable income and the mean log deviation of household disposable income from these samples. In the average for developed countries we consider is 0.19, while the average for the Latin American countries we consider is 0.43. Now, if we decompose this, we find that within large urban areas, right, we have on average for rich countries is about 0.05, while for Latin America there's 0.11. So more than twice the inequality within large urban areas than in developed countries. However, if we look at the proportion of this within term to overall inequality, that is, how much does this term contribute to overall inequality, we find that in developed countries, inequality within large urban areas represents about 30% of overall inequality, while for Latin America is somewhat smaller, but within the same range or ballpark. So you could say that they're not that different. So from a structural point of view, within large urban area inequality roughly contributes the same amount to overall inequality between LAC countries and developed countries. If we look at within small urban areas, there's also a large difference between Latin America and developed countries. However, once again, the contribution of within a small urban area inequality, total inequality is higher on average in developed countries, right? So there's not such a large structural difference between these two sets of countries in this dimension. Now, if we look at within inequality, within rural areas inequality, once again, Latin America is more unequal, except in the case of Uruguay. And however, the contribution to the total is still quite similar. It's equal on average between developed and developing countries. Where we do find a big difference is the between large and small urban areas. Now, this contributes very little to overall inequality, less than 1/100th in the case of developed countries, and just 1% or 1% in the case of Latin America. However, we do have a larger difference here in how much it contributes to overall inequality. While On average, in developed countries, this represents 1.2% overall inequality. It's more than twice, almost three times as large in Latin America. That is this between term. One way to interpret this is that there's more difference between large and small urban areas inequality in Latin America than in rich countries. And between rural and urban areas, there's a large difference also. Once again, this is a very small term. As I argued earlier, the Elmo critique indicates that this will always be a small term. But here we find as a very large structural difference, more than 10 times. That is, while the rural-urban divide in richer countries hardly has any influence in overall inequality, in Latin America, the urban-rural divide explains a significant amount over overall inequality, 8.5% on average. But for some countries, such as Peru, this is about 18% or 17% of overall inequality is explained by the average income in rural areas to the average income in urban areas. That is, the poor are more concentrated in rural areas compared to urban areas in Latin America compared to developed countries. And if we look now at the Elmo approach and look at the between term between large and small urban areas, we find that there's a big difference. That is, in Latin America, the between term represents close to 10% of the maximum this term could achieve, while in developed countries it is only 4% of the maximum. If we look at the Elmo approach, but for the rural-urban divide, what we find is that this is 10 times higher for Latin America than for developed countries. In fact, in a country such as Peru, right, the between term, between rural and urban area inequality term, reaches more than 40% of its maximum. That is, there's a wide segregation between poor people in rural areas and the richer people in urban areas.
Excuse me,
Right. So it's as if
Professor
income do
Gomez.
not overlap that much between households in rural areas and households in urban areas. They're much more segregated in the case of Peru.
I have a quick
Um,
question, Professor
so
Gomez.
to summarize our result, or before some robustness checks, we do several robustness checks. We eliminate 1% of observations at the top and the bottom of the income distribution. We use alternative definition of small and large urban areas for some countries, and the basic results do not change. So how can we summarize this? Well, we know LAC is more unequal than OECD countries overall, but they're also more unequal in all the spatial dimensions we analyze. Right, within smaller urban areas, within larger urban areas, within rural areas. But inequality within small and medium urban areas seems to be more important than inequality within large metropolitan areas in Latin America. That is something that already Ferre et al. Argued, and that is that in Latin America, there's more poor people relatively in absolute term in small urban areas than in large urban areas. And so more attention has to be paid to the smaller urban areas. And naturally also between the rural and urban divide. That is, the big difference, structural difference between Latin America and richer countries is that there's still a significant rural-urban divide compared to those other countries. To a lesser extent, the average difference between big and smaller urban areas. So those are the two of our three dimensions or scales of analysis. What about within urban segregation? Now, there's no comparative studies we can analyze or data that we can use to analyze this, to compare between LAC and US and Europe, for example. But we can approximate this issue indirectly. And for that, we use the Atlas of Urban Expansion data, which is a very interesting database of over 200 cities and metropolitan areas, 26 from cities from LAC from 12 countries. And we also refer to some case studies in the paper, not so much in my presentation. But there's several interesting things that come out of this analysis. The first is that Latin America, which is there in the fifth, from the top, the fifth row, is denser. Cities are denser in Latin America than in developed countries, even compared to Europe, which is something we did not expect. That is, that urban density would be higher in Europe, for example, than in Latin America. But that's not the case. Also, in Latin America, cities tend to be smaller. That's the first row, right? Bigger cities tend to be smaller compared to larger or big cities in developed countries and Europe, and also for small cities. That is, in developed countries, cities are more widespread, right? Something also we didn't expect. Another interesting index is compactness. This has to do with how circular is the city. So you look at how many square miles or square kilometers a city has, and then you compare that with how the same area, the same surface area, if it were a circle, how does distances to the middle of the circle compare um, in those two cities? That is, how close are the cities to a circle, which a circle minimizes travel distance to the center and travel distance between any 2 points within the city. So the more round or circle-like a city is, right, the lower the travel distances for households. And what we find, again, in the fifth row, is that Latin America has a higher compactness index, both the proximity index and the cohesion index. That is, Latin American cities tend to be more circular compared to European or other rich developed countries. Their city seems to be more circular, which would imply that travel distances are lower compared to developed countries. Now, to summarize the result, then in Latin America, cities tend to be more dense, compact, and more saturated. It's something I didn't talk about, but we do in the paper. That is, there less open space than developed country cities. Um, so one would tend to think that this implies less segregation in terms of less travel times for poor people in large cities because they're denser, travel distances are smaller, they're more circular-like, they're more closer to a circle, which minimizes travel distance. However, we also know from other data or previous research that in Latin America, the poor tend to live in the outskirts of the city, that is the periphery of cities. And this is different from developed countries. Now, this can be explained by a standard urban economic model. When people don't have a lot of money to travel, or there's not a lot of infrastructure to travel, and travel is slow, a city will tend to be more dense, more compact, uh, and the richer people will live closer to the center to minimize the travel costs to the center of the city, where what's called the central business district, where jobs are, right? But as a country grows or a city's income grows and more infrastructure is built, the rich will tend to go out to the suburbs where they can find lower cost to have uh, larger houses, that is, to spend more on a larger house, and they'll travel longer. But since there's more infrastructure, this costs less than before, and the poor will tend um, to live in the central part of the city. And that's a dynamic that we see in certain cities as they develop with the standard urban economic model. So Latin America would tend to be in the previous low income, low infrastructure development stage, where the rich tend to live in the central part and the poor tend to live in the periphery of the cities. So all I've talked about now is diagnosis. What are the possible causes of this spatial inequality and the policy responses um, we can uh, talk about? And please, if when I reach the hour, stop me. right? Or tell me 10 minutes before I'm finished so that I can stop talking because I have
So we have about
quite a lot of material in this presentation. So
yeah,
I'm
we
going to
have
talk about four
about
issues. The
15 more
first
minutes.
is somewhat perhaps surprising, which is trade policy and internal migration. That is, how much do trade policies or what influence do trade policies have on spatial inequality? And this comes to mind because the import substitution development strategy that Latin America adopted after the 1939 and after the 1930s, and particularly after World War II, basically what it did is that it was biased against agriculture, promoting migration to the cities where manufacturing was located close to urban areas. That is, this forced manufacturing development strategy, what it did is that it concentrated jobs near cities, and that produced a lot of migration to the cities during the 40s, the 50s, even the 60s. And that may have contributed to spatial inequality, given that rural areas were very, very poor. There was nothing, there were no jobs in rural areas, etc. And so the hypothesis here is that trade liberalization from the 80s on could have stopped or reversed this rural urban migration trend and even this rural urban income divide, right? Now, there's not much research in this area. And in general, from a theoretical point of view, trade liberalization is not, it's not clear what the income distribution between rural and urban areas will be. However, for Latin America, there's some evidence that it will reduce the rural-urban divide, average rural wages compared to average urban wages, given that we're a natural resource-rich continent or continents, right? So export-led growth will tend to be resource export-led growth or natural resource export led growth, which will favor rural areas. And now I have some results here that are not in the published paper. I think perhaps in the working paper they're there, but not in the published version, which is how does the within rural inequality correlate with agricultural raw material exports? And we can see that there's a negative correlation. Now, we know that correlation does not imply causation, so we have to be careful with this, but this is quite suggestive. That is, the higher that agricultural raw material exports are to GDP, the lower the within rural area inequality is. And also the between term, that is, this is within rural area inequality is lower when there's a lot of agricultural exports. And also the between, that is the average difference between rural area income and urban area income, is also seems to be correlated, negatively correlated with agricultural raw material exports, right? So this would seem to imply that trade liberalization in Latin America would tend to reduce within rural inequality and also within rural and the between term of rural urban inequality. What about differences in urban areas and trade liberalization? This is ambiguous. So we do have more evidence that trade liberalization may be one of the policy alternatives to reduce rural urban inequality. But what about big and small urban areas inequality, and how does trade affect that? And this is ambiguous, right? It will depend a lot where the large and the small cities are. Are there coastal cities with ports? Are there in the border between countries, etc.? And do not correlate with trade variables. However, there is some evidence, a study by Henderson for 85 countries between 1960 and 1990, that the importance of the primal city, that is the metropolitan bias, tends to decline with trade openness. And just as a note, I'll show you data for Chile, it's only 1 point. So you have to take this information very carefully, but it's highly suggestive. In Chile, you had urban primacy index, that is what share of the population does the biggest city have, the biggest two cities have, and the biggest three cities have over overall population. That is, the blue line, for example, tells you that by 1982, close to 50% of the population in Chile lived in the biggest three cities, right? And the gray line, C1, tells you the percentage of population that lives in the largest city, which in this case is Santiago. And this dynamic is very interesting because what it shows you is that in the 50s, this census data, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, up to 1982, the primal urban primacy was growing very strong as people migrated from rural areas to the largest cities. However, once trade was liberalized in the 70s and the export-led growth picked up in the 80s, this stopped completely, right? The rural-urban migration stopped, and you can see this quite clearly what happened afterwards. And so trade may have something to do with spatial inequality, and that's something that we should research more, right? But our conjecture with available evidence is that trade liberalization uh, helps to reduce spatial inequality in Latin America. There's a second issue that deals with agglomeration forces. That is, we know that wages are higher in larger urban areas. And this has been attributed to agglomeration economies. That is, people and firms are more productive when they reside and they work in large urban areas and when they don't. Part of the story is that you can specialize, right? If you're a doctor in a small town, you have to do everything. If you're a doctor in a big city, you can specialize in one area, and there you have higher division of labor and thus higher productivity, an idea going back to Adam Smith. And thus something may be happening here that people flock to the big cities because they're more productive, they earn higher wages, right? And the question is, could we reduce spatial inequality by moving people from rural areas to urban areas, either small urban areas or large urban areas? That is, we move people low productivity, workers from rural areas earning very low wages to urban areas where, because of agglomeration forces, they would earn higher wages. But this is tricky because it may be that higher wages in urban areas are compensating for other things, amenities, for example. There's high crime rates, higher pollution. You have to travel, congestion's higher, so travel times are longer, and this compensates for the higher wages. And there's some evidence for this, that if you bring people from rural areas to urban areas, they may have higher income, but not necessarily higher welfare, right? And also what they gain in agglomeration economies in urban areas, you may lose in the areas where people are emigrating from, as population density drops in those areas. So it's not clear what the welfare implications would be of moving people from low wage rural areas to higher wage urban areas. There's another hypothesis, and that is
Professor
that
Gomez,
there's
we have
skill
about
sorting. That is,
Professor
the
Gomez.
higher skilled individuals are the ones that migrate to urban areas, right? And that creates this rural urban divide, right? The more skilled, more energetic, whatever you want to call it, move to the city. They earn higher wages, not because they pay higher wages in urban areas, just it's because they have higher skill levels. And the sorting, is what creates this rural urban divide. And you can't eliminate that forcibly, because if you move the lower skilled people that still live in rural areas to urban areas, they're not going to earn the same as the people that emigrated earlier, that were the high skilled people. And Young finds that the whole rural urban gap can be completely explained by the sorting effect in the labor market, right? High skilled migration. Also, there's evidence that the people that migrate from rural areas to urban areas are relatively more educated than the ones that stay in the rural areas. So this brings us back once again to trade liberalization, how to increase skilled labor demand in rural areas or small urban areas rather than try to move people from rural areas to urban areas.
Professor Gomez, we have about
Another issue
5
has to
more
do with
minutes.
infrastructure investment. This is a big issue
We have about 5 more
um,
minutes.
because the question is here, how could we reduce spatial inequality, particularly the urban-rural divide, by investing in more infrastructure, rural infrastructure, letting rural households have access to education opportunity, health opportunities, or labor opportunities near, their urban areas, be they large or small, right? Um, and there's some uh, research in this area. However, there's still a lot to do. There's more research within urban areas where we have about 4 more minutes. Okay, let me just finish this then. Um, this is a big area of research currently. Zárate, for example, shows that when you build a new metro line in Mexico City, informal workers could find work in the central part of the city. Formal work, they were more productive, they earned higher wages. So urban infrastructure investments allow more lowers income inequality within the city. Also, Sivanides for Transmillennium Bogota. Um, and there's a lot of research going on in that area. Um, I just cite some research on that. It's optimal spatial policies, very recent. Some research for Mexico, and what these researchers do is they use a quantitative spatial economic model where firms and residents endogenously decide where to live and where to work when there are urban agglomeration economies, and then see what happens if you put infrastructure that's lower transport costs and how people will rearrange where they live, firms where they locate, and what happens then with incomes and inequality. One key finding of this research is that conventional cost benefit analysis of infrastructure investments usually underestimates the benefit of these investments and by a wide margin. So when we evaluate projects or we do a cost benefit analysis, we must keep in mind that there are a lot of effects that infrastructure generates that's not contemplated in a conventional cost benefit analysis of infrastructure projects. So this is in the frontier of research, and the impact on inequality is still not so clear, but obviously infrastructure plays a role in reducing spatial inequality. There's another issue with transport services. It may be that infrastructure is not enough. We need also to consider transport subsidies. That is, if a poor rural household, they may have a road, but if they have no way of getting to the city because they can't afford a car, or because there's no public transport, or it's very expensive, then infrastructure will not be enough. And this is an issue that has received even less attention than the infrastructure issue. And what I do is here, but I'm not going to have time to show you, is that the example of rural transport subsidies in the case of Chile, where this is one region, there's a formal rural transport subsidies, both for land transport, water transport, even air transport, to allow isolated communities to have access to urban areas. And here's an example of how isolation is determined. Those are the subsidies, the services that are subsidized. The blue are water subsidies, the red are bus subsidies. You also have free school transport subsidies for rural areas. That's the map of the subsidies there. So this is an area, this is just an example. This this program has not been evaluated, and there's a big research question there is what impact these subsidies had, because these subsidies were only introduced after 2010. And so what did these subsidies, the impact of these subsidies in economic and social outcomes for isolated communities? A fourth issue, before I finish then, is land markets and land use regulations, particularly in urban areas. That is, some land use regulation and housing policies have tended in Latin America to push people, poorer people, to the periphery. For example, floor area ratios regulations, when you can't build high-rise residential buildings in the central part of cities, the poor, that will tend to increase housing prices in the central part of cities. The poor people will tend to go to the outskirts of the city or live in inner city slums with a very small floor space, right? They will live in a very small floor space. They'll prefer that, but being close to jobs, than living in the outskirts where it's cheaper. They can have a larger living space, but they'll have to travel long distances to get to jobs. So this is also an issue that has to be borne in mind if we want to tackle at least urban segregation. So to conclude and to open the seminar to questions, let me just say that there's no silver bullet to overcome spatial inequality. Naturally, social policies geared to rural areas is obviously recommended. Also, more attention needs to be paid to poverty and inequality in smaller or non-central urban areas. Trade openness and infrastructure investments are suggestive as a policy solution, but more research is required to optimize these policies in the case of Latin America. Another idea is that infrastructure may not be enough. Subsidies may also have to be considered so that poor individuals in rural areas can use this infrastructure and have real access to services, to labor markets, and educational opportunities in urban areas. And in the case of urban inequality, more attention needs to be placed on land use regulations and floor area ratio limits that may be contributing to segregation and inequality. Thank you.
Perfect, perfect, perfect. Okay, so now we are in our Q&A.
Sorry, I don't hear you well.
You cannot hear me? Can you hear me?
It's just that I have my, I think I'm having problems with, I can hear you, but not very loud but that's a problem on my side. So if you could write the questions on the chat, that would be easier for me.
Perfect. Okay, so we have our Q&A portion. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. We should have some questions for Professor Gomez-Lobo. So please, please put your questions in the Q&A box. Okay, so I will read the first question. Even though you should be able to see it, I'll go ahead and read it. It says, in your analysis, you highlight that spatial inequality in Latin America manifests at multiple scales, rural versus urban, large versus small urban areas, and within cities. Given that infrastructure investments in urban planning play a significant role in shaping these disparities, what specific policies or planning strategies do you believe are most effective in reducing spatial inequality without reinforcing existing socioeconomic segregation?
Okay, that's a good question. Let's divide the answer in two points. One is urban inequality or segregation. What I would say there is that public transport infrastructure should be prioritized, right? Lower income people tend to use more public transport, which is, there's a lot of evidence for that. And so whatever improves public transport or makes travel speeds higher in public transport, thus travel times lower when using public transport, then that will generally benefit more lower income individuals. They'll have more access to education, health, and labor opportunities. There's evidence for this in Transmilenio in Bogota, Sivanidis' paper, which is coming out, if is forthcoming in American Economic Review, shows that Transmilenio, this is a bus rapid transit investment infrastructure in the year 2000 that then grew, helped to reduce urban segregation and had a positive welfare impact. Also for Mexico, as I already mentioned, building a metro line to poorer areas in the outskirts of the city allowed informal workers to switch to formal work inside or in the central part of the city, which also increased their income. So public transport investment is certainly part of the answer. Now, between rural areas and urban areas, infrastructure is probably also important, but their research has been less, or it's an area that's been less researched, because what may happen is that, for example, some rural area activities may be negatively affected as production is now, transport costs are lower, production is transported to the smaller cities. Let me give you an example. This has to do with economic geography. You know, you have a rural areas where someone is producing something, right, and selling it to rural households. But now that transport costs are smaller, households have access to buying that good or service in a small town near the rural areas once you have the infrastructure in place. And so those households as consumers benefit because they access the good at lower prices, but the producer, right, will have lower income. So in the case of infrastructure between rural areas and urban areas, the things are more subtle, right? And more analysis has to be done. But certainly for access to health opportunities, educational opportunities, more transport infrastructure will certainly be part of the answer.
Okay. Let's see. We should have another question, but I have a question. Can you hear me now, or should I type
Yes,
this?
yes.
Okay.
No, I can hear you. I fixed the
Okay.
problem.
So, in the article, you mentioned that in the rural areas, mm, the populations were heavily indigenous. Do you think there could be like a racial or ethnic aspect to the high rates of inequality in Latin America between the rural areas versus the urban areas due to like the way that people look or their ancestry?
Well, uh, as you know, this paper is one paper within a research project, the Lustig research project, which is much more it's broader, and within the research papers, there's one that particularly analyzes that issue, right? Ethnic inequality, racial inequality, and so I'm not a big expert in that topic, but what I would say is that there is evidence that in Latin America, right, ethnic minorities, indigenous population, for example, tend to live more in rural areas. This is not so clear in the case of racial ethnicity, but yes, with indigenous population. If they live more in rural areas, then are they poor because they live in rural areas, or are they poor because of discrimination or because they're indigenous, whatever? And that's very difficult to answer. But I would look at it in a positive way, in the sense that the policy prescription there would also be the same. That is, give these people access to educational opportunities, health opportunities, and labor opportunities in urban areas. There's some research on that. I have another paper where I looked into that. And the interesting thing is that when you build rural roads, right, uh, it tends to be that female students have more access to education and opportunities. Those are the ones that take most use of it. In a couple of countries, there's some case studies. So there is some evidence that, at least from a social point of view, whatever the reason, whether it's isolation or some racial or ethnic discrimination that keeps these people poor, infrastructure that allows them to have access to urban capitals or urban areas will definitely help. Also, internet connection. That's another issue. I've talked about road infrastructure, but we must not forget that uh, having internet access can also be an answer to health and educational issues for rural areas.
Perfect, perfect. Do we have any more questions for our Q&A session? Any more questions? Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Gomez. We were so happy to have you. We really appreciate you taking time to talk about your paper with us and spatial inequality. Thank you so much. Everyone else, we will see you on Thursday and we will continue our presentations.